I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be talking to Rufi Thorpe about Margo's Got Money Troubles. This book has been on my mind pretty much nonstop since I started reading it, and I can't wait to talk more about it and about Margo and Arby's and wrestling and the challenges that this world puts on women. I remember reading The Knockout Queen for the first time a few years ago and really just being like, oh, these are voices that work for me. And I found it all again in this book. So, Rufi, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I mean, there's literally nothing I want to talk about more than Arby's and wrestling. Thank you so much.
So I like to start with just having you set up the book a little bit for us, just sort of your elevator pitch on Margo and her world.
Margo is a community college student who has an affair with her English professor and winds up getting knocked up and decides to keep the baby and then supports herself with an OnlyFans account with help from her ex-pro wrestler dad. And her account starts to actually flourish and take off. And of course, that's when all the real trouble begins.
I remember seeing the description for this book and being like, okay, that could be so many things. And it could be so wonderful or so spooky.
It is a lot. It is, I think, important. It's a really fun book. It's like ultimately like a comedic and extremely hopeful book. And that's really what I wanted. I really wanted to write about like the mechanics of female empowerment. And there was like a really, I have not rewatched it, but there was like a 90s cowgirl movie that had Drew Barrymore in it that I believe was called Bad Girls. And I just like can remember being a little girl in the movie theater watching that movie. And I was like, I want to be a bad girl. Like I wanted to write a book that would make women feel like that. Like I have all this power I didn't know I had.
I love that comparison. I think there's probably about 7 people on the planet that have seen that movie.
Well, they're my readers. If you saw that movie or you even remotely know what I'm talking about. Also, Wild Hearts Cannot Be Broken. Can we just like have a moment for that movie that I feel like shaped the psyche of like because it was always on. It was always on cable TV. And I was like, I clearly need to jump horses into a very small bucket of water. And that is what fulfillment for me as a woman is going to look like.
And just those moments of trying to understand female ambition in a way that is safe for the world and then quickly realizing that that does not exist.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
As soon as I started reading, was encountered with Margo's incredible voice, which is something that is so distinct in your writing, the way that you can imbue these characters with so much personality and realness and connection just through the way that you write their thoughts and their feelings. And I think none of this book works without Margo herself being so dimensional and real. So I was wondering how Margo's voice came to you as you started writing.
Well, I think so for me, voice is always part of it. And I don't know if both my parents were actors. And so like that, even like doing an impression, that kind of like ventriloquism of like, how does someone hold themselves? How are they talking? How do they think about things is really the heart of character for me, figuring out as an author how someone talks. And so I tend to do like a ton of exploratory writing before I figure out the character, and I have to write a lot and throw away a lot. And so for me, Margo, I really kind of like found her in her that space where she's in when she's first having the affair with Mark, where there is another part of her that's watching really like critically and detached and is aware that he's not a good person, aware that he's kind of beneath her. But there's also a way in which like she hasn't figured out yet that she's supposed to be in control of her life. And so she's sort of just observing. And that was where she really started as a character for me. But I think the book didn't come alive for me until I found Jinx, her dad. And the moment that first scene that I wrote with him, I was like, oh, here's the book. You know, the book is going to be about this relationship. And so that was really fun because I originally hadn't planned him as a character at all. And it was just that I happened to get obsessed with wrestling during the period that I was working on this book. And me and my mom walked the dogs together every day. And I kept telling her wrestling stories on these walks. And she's like, it's a shame you can't work wrestling into this book. Like maybe she could become a wrestler or something. And I was like, no. There's no way I can fit wrestling into this book. It's already too crazy. Adding pro wrestling. But then the more I was thinking about it, pro wrestling and the sex work have so much in common. And I just felt like it was a really interesting way of taking sex work and making a living off of your body and looking at it in a new way, in a less puritanical way, kind of. So then I was like, what if it's her dad? And that really appealed to me. And so that was very exciting, finding Jinx.
I have to say, Jinx is my absolute favorite part of this novel. He was so interesting and funny and like kind of like a sad puppy at times in a way that just like is so endearing and easy to just be like, oh, of course. And I think I was apprehensive at first when I started reading about what their relationship is going to be, because I think it would have been very easy to have sort of a stereotypical like absent father relationship, but there's so much love between Margo and Jinx, and I really enjoyed getting to watch that dynamic.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's always interesting for me. So I grew up only child of a single mom, and I didn't know my dad until we had sort of like a brief friendship when I was like 18, 19. So I keep writing father-daughter relationships though. And I remember the first time an interviewer asked me about it, I like had kind of an out-of-body experience. I like had a panic attack during the interview, and I was like, why do I keep doing that? But I think maybe because it's just purely such a fictive space, like it's not a space that I have a ton of baggage about. And so I get to just like imagine these father-daughter relationships. But also with Jinx, part of what was so fun is wrestling has such a strong tradition of memoir. And so pretty much every wrestler of any level of repute has at least one, and oftentimes multiple, published memoirs in which they are sometimes with a ghostwriter, but sometimes they write them themselves. Unlike a lot of most other more high profile celebrity memoirs are always written by a ghostwriter, but there's a lot of wrestlers that wrote their own. And I don't know what I was expecting, but I was not expecting wrestlers to be as complicated, as educated, as introspective as they are. And so it was really a joy to get to write a Jinx who was not a stereotype of what we might think a professional wrestler is, but was based more on actual professional wrestlers as I came to know them through their memoirs.
As someone who grew up watching professional wrestling and has such a soft spot for it, I love the portrayal of it because it really felt humanized in a way that a lot of people, incorrectly so, would say like, you know, that's a tough connection to make of literary fiction and professional wrestling. But I think there's so much artistry in it, and you really do a great job of displaying like this is a world. It's not just like some TV show that people watch. Like there's dynasties, there's connection, there's so much familial passing down of traits and story that there's so much.
Yeah, it's such an incredible world, I think, as a fiction writer. I mean, so for me, I grew up like only child, single mom, and also raised by my grandmother. So in our house, it was all musical theater all the time. There was no professional wrestling on. And so I really only started watching wrestling. Really, it was during the pandemic. My boys were 4 and 7 when the pandemic started. And all they wanted to do all day long was watch WWE and then wrestle on the trampoline. And so I was watching a ton of it. And for me, as a huge fan of drag, I was like, oh, I have a category for this already. Like the campiness, the over-the-topness, the costumes, the cattiness, the infighting, the sort of like exaggerated version of reality being played with for fun and artistry. Like I had a mental category for it, and I immediately became a fan, and then fell totally in love with all of the backstories. And it was just such a compelling, I mean, you have like the drama of the Monday Night Wars happening when we were growing up in the Attitude Era. And it was just all of it was so fascinating to me.
It's very fun. And I think it adds so much depth to this novel. I was sort of surprised to see how much really ties this novel to like right now. There's a lot of reference to things that are very current, where I think sometimes we tend to stray away from writing things that really tie things to the moment of right now versus 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I think it's a little bit easier to look back than to try and categorize where we are now. But I think there's something really important about all the references to OnlyFans, to TikTok, to Fortnite, to these things that are so prevalent in our culture as we are seeing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's purely a function of me having little kids and constantly watching YouTube and being like, this is interesting. The world is changing and it's unrecognizable and some of it's really cool. I think that I love pop culture, and I think that I mean, for me, the dream is to marry the craftsmanship and philosophical depth of high literary fiction and put it on the chassis of a genre novel that has a plot and is page turning and is fun to read and there's not a sentence wasted and where you can't put it down. And that's sort of the dream, is that there shouldn't really be a distinction between high and low culture. I don't think that there really needs to be one. I think it's sort of more of a historical thing that grew out of maybe academia or just class issues. And so I don't know. It was really fun to try and push the novel to talk about right now. But it's also, you never know, because the pipeline for publishing a novel is so long. And so I was writing this, mostly during the pandemic, and even then was setting it a couple of years in the past. The book is set in 2017, 2018. And so even trying to remember, I would have my kids read the Fortnite scenes and make sure that I wasn't using guns that came out later. You know what I mean? Because even the online world changes so fast, TikTok changes so fast, and even trying, as I was going through and trying to make sure everything is current, it's easy to forget what TikTok was 5 years ago. It was a totally different landscape.
Absolutely. And we have such a different, it's become so much more normalized and just an extension of our lives now versus I think, at that point, these characters, Margo and her coworkers, her friends, they're really on the forefront of so much. And that is so wild to think about that, because now we're
oh, of course, obviously we'd be doing this. But yeah, the idea is sort of that they're trying to, invent it all from scratch.
And now we're so used to people being content creators, and that's an accepted job. And even when there are pieces like OnlyFans that I think still do have incredibly stigmatized views of their validity in our space, I think go back 5 years and that was so radical.
Oh, 100% agree. I mean, for me, so I had always wanted to write a character who took the Madonna whore complex, the two ways that our culture is messed up about women, and just sort of exploded it by being a mom and a sex worker, by being a Madonna and a whore, and she's badass and she's a superhero. That was all. And I just loved the idea of this character. But I was how am I ever going to do it? We put mothers on this pedestal and people are so sort of reflexively stigmatized about sex work in really ways that I feel we haven't, I feel there's a moment where we really need to culturally re-examine why we have the stigmas against sex work that we do. When I saw OnlyFans taking off at the beginning of the pandemic, because I think at the beginning of the pandemic, they went something from 20 million users to 120 million users in a year, in a calendar year. And it partially you have every waitress in America suddenly didn't have a job. And every man in America was staying at home. And so it was this perfect marriage kind of for this cultural explosion. And I think having it be non-physical so that you're not in as much danger made women consider it more, and also made it less stigmatized for them to pursue it. Because I think a lot of the stigma against sex work is about endangering yourself and, self-respect and not, taking care of yourself. And so I saw people talking about OnlyFans in a new way where I was this is my chance. If I'm ever going to write this Madonna horror character, OnlyFans is the gray area where people are enough open to it that I could actually have this conversation in an interesting, nuanced way. And so it's been it's really fascinating. And even for me, I thought that I was a very liberal person who had no stigmas against sex work. But in the writing of it, I had to really, take apart every single stigma that I did have and all the things that I hadn't thought about yet and I just hadn't examined. And so it's been really, I don't think I I don't think I understood how great the stigma was against sex work until I started getting like more reads of this book from just random readers that were people that I didn't know, and understood that like a lot of this was like stuff they hadn't really thought about before, and that it was exciting to them because it was asking them to look at it in a new way and look at it again, and they found it empowering and exciting. And so that was a huge gift, kind of.
Something that kept coming up for me, and it comes up a lot with, you know, many of my friends that I talk with, all these things about this concept that you really can't win in so many ways as a woman, a young woman, this idea of whether you choose to have an abortion or choose to have your child, you've really lost either way in the societal world, because you've either made this choice or you no longer have any support, or, you know, people vilify you for your choices. And to watch Margo grapple with that was like eye-opening, and it was easy to connect to as someone who's like lived in this world and seen and experienced so many of these things.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you think about the public judgment of girls that do OnlyFans is counterbalanced by the public judgment that people have for the trad wives, right? And that whole trend online, like there is no, if you keep the baby, then you're a teen mom and you're irresponsible and you can't provide for your baby and you did the wrong thing. If you have an abortion, you are, you know, a horrible person, and there's all sorts of judgment associated with that. But then if you don't have sex at all and you refuse, then you're, you know, a prude and you're not embracing your power as a woman. It's like there is literally no way that you can be that is going to free you from societal judgment. And I think that is one of the things that is about trying to be a good girl is a trap. It is going to limit your mobility and the choices that you make. And so you can't use only other people's good opinion as a map to how you should comport yourself. And you have to start creating your own moral code where you understand, like, well, what does it mean to me to be a good person? What are my values? Because you can't only use the judgment of others in order to make truly ethical decisions in how you're going to live your life. And I think if anything, social media has maybe like fast forward us to understanding, like, you literally can't please everybody. And so using the opinions of others, you're not going to be able to get anywhere doing that.
And something I loved so much about Margo is how incredibly capable she is at all times, even when she doesn't think she is, or maybe other people don't think she is. She has this control over herself and her thoughts and desires, and she is always able to make the decision she needs to. And I loved reading that.
Oh, I'm so glad. It's one of the, like, you know, trying to figure out the balance with her about, I mean, because also she cries a lot, you know, like, and as a writer, you're always like, how many scenes exactly has she burst into tears in her bedroom? Like, that might be too many. But she's going through it. And I think one of my favorite things about her as a character is that she has this ability to kind of just, the world keeps bopping her on the nose and hitting her in the face. And she's like, ugh. And then she has to keep going. I mean, that's one of the things when you have a little baby, it stops being all about you. You don't have the luxury. Like, you may break down crying, but you got 15 minutes tops, you know, and then you have to keep going and figure out how it's all going to work.
I love when she says that she thinks her son assumes that all adults just have wet faces because she cries. So and I'm like, you know what a good way to look at that. I really appreciated the way that Margo is able to create support systems for herself in this novel, that not only does she have her father, who turns out to be like an incredible grandpa and just is like so involved even through his own ups and downs, but she has a roommate, Susie, that turns out to be a great support system for her. She makes these connections in other places. And I think this aspect of looking for community when maybe the people that you thought were supposed to be those people, those safe spaces, turn out to be not that.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there's nothing that having a child makes you realize. That whole it takes a village thing, that's true. The idea of the nuclear family is flawed. And it's especially impossible when you don't even have a second person. Like when you don't even have a dad helping you, it becomes even more, You need that community. But I also think it's an important part of female empowerment in general is lifting each other up. And I feel like female friendship has been so crucial for me in my life in terms of finding myself as an artist, figuring out how to be a person, figuring out how to make good decisions. My female friends have been the resource that held me up at so many difficult parts of my life. And Susie was one of those sleeper characters for me that I didn't know. When I originally started writing, I was like, she has these roommates, and Susie was pretty immediately one of my favorite ones. But I didn't know what a large role she was going to come to play in the book. But she just sort of like kept weaseling her way in and ultimately wound up becoming one of my favorite characters. But I also love the OnlyFans girls that she meets. And doing all the OnlyFans research was also just a ton of fun. In part, it was just like a surreal escape. I mean, I was in charge of Zoom school for my 4 and 7-year-old. I was like running Zoom kindergarten. And then in the other window, I'm like on OnlyFans, like trying to message girls and like... because you can't, their time is valuable and they know it, you know, and they're running a business and they know exactly how much their time is worth. And so trying to talk to them on other social media was totally impossible. So I opened an OnlyFans account because that way I could send tips with my money, you know, so I'd send $50 and be like, I'm a novelist. I promise, here's like links to like my work. I'm like a real person. And I really want to get this research right. I really want to represent this as a job. I really am not interested in writing something like prurient. I want to represent you as like a businesswoman. I want to understand how your business works. And so it was just very, I don't know, it's like that's maybe the funnest part of being a novelist is getting to do that weird research. And I think especially at a time in my life where, you know, my husband had a much more like real job than I did. And so all the childcare, I was suddenly stuck in the house with 2 little kids doing Zoom kindergarten, my own work like ground to a halt. And so having this somewhat illicit activity of writing to these girls, and like we definitely had to have budgetary conversations about how much money I was spending on OnlyFans. But it was like, it allowed me to still feel artistically alive at a time when I felt more constrained by motherhood than I ever had.
And that's something, I mean, motherhood is just depicted across literature in truly every single way, you know, possible. And yet, I think if you polled a lot of women, I think many of them would say that they don't always see what it actually feels like for them to, you know, in media. And there are so many other ways. There's so many ways to experience these things. And Margo's just figuring them out as she sort of grows up along with Bodhi. And it's so interesting to watch. And it's so like, you just feel for her so much the whole time.
There's so much more that I wish that I could have put in about motherhood in this book. I mean, first, she only has like the first little taste of motherhood, you know, she's in the baby time, which is such a magical and such an overwhelming time. I think the common threads that I see in my friends who have had children is just that first year is so much harder than you think it's going to be. It's the hardest thing you've ever done and is so transcendent. The kind of falling in love with your child is so big and so akin to romantic love in a way that at least really surprised me. As a mother. And I really wanted to try and capture that. But there's so much more I wish I could. There were all these scenes with her pediatrician that got cut. But I was like, I wish I could write a 1-act play that's just like awkward interactions between women and their pediatricians. That like,
I kind of wondered if there was like, how many things did it make it in? Because there is a part where her pediatrician calls her like overly conscientious. And I was like, that's interesting because we didn't see that. But I wonder always when I'm reading books, like how much makes it to the cutting room floor of like things that you just wish but can't.
This one was hard because the longest of my previous books was like 80,000 words. Margo is 93,000 words. When I finished, was 150,000 words. So a full, almost novel-length manuscript was cut out of this book. And some of it was I just loved these characters so much that I was literally following them around to the grocery store. And also, I really wanted to figure out how TikTok works and how you would actually build this kind of thing. So I was in the weeds, and there was a lot of scenes that people were like, this is boring. If I see another conversation about algorithms and how they work, I will throw this book across the wall. And I was like, okay, fair, fair, fair. And there was so much more wrestling. There was an abundance of enthusiasm on my part, but I really wanted it to be like a tight, propulsive novel where you're not getting too much in the weeds. And so it was about like cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. And honestly, I would do it all over again. I feel like it gave it a lot of writing it long and then cutting it down allows you to keep only your best material. And I feel like it made the book a lot stronger.
And it moves. I mean, as I was reading, it goes so fast through some of these things, and not in a way that feels like we're skimming, but just in I have to put my seatbelt on because I feel like I need to keep my hands and feet inside the car at all times. Otherwise, there could be some sort of danger. And I really enjoy that. I think it definitely connects with me, the idea of you saying, you want to take some of that propulsiveness of genre fiction and, slap it onto something that is like more traditional literary fiction. Because you do have these incredible sentences that you build, and there's a lot of craft, especially in this idea of perspective, because we're sort of bouncing back and forth between first person and a third person view. And at first I was like, hold on a second, and had to go back and look and be like, did I miss? But no, as soon as I figured it out, I was like, that's so good, that dichotomy between the perspectives.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I love impossible narrative positions and books that kind of like play on that meta level. And I just felt that so much of the thematic material of the book in terms of wrestling, but also her building her persona on OnlyFans, this like talk about, do you present yourself as a baby face, like a good guy, or a heel, a bad guy? And the ways that we show ourselves to the world, so much of fiction writing, and especially first person, is putting on a mask and saying, okay, I'm Margo now. And the reader knows it's not. You see my name on the front of the book. You know the whole time it's Rufi Thorpe writing this. Margo is not a real person, but we all agree Margo is a real person, right? And playing with that and seeing how far can I stretch the reader's multiple levels of awareness of who's creating this text and who's addressing them, and how we're playing with it, like before it stops being fun. You don't want to break the illusion. You don't want to puncture it. You just want to like bring it hovering up into the reader's awareness so that it kind of like rings like a bell. I find it such a fascinating human activity. The fact that like we started making masks and putting them on and then like acting out weird stuff for each other from like the before civilization started, like that's as old as we are, that behavior. That's the origin of art, is like, okay, and now I'm somebody else. I've put on a mask and now we're going to pretend that I'm, this god. And now we're going to act out and we're going to play pretend. That is a really weird thing for a species of animal to do so consistently across all cultures. And I feel like it is really just core to our nature in a way that endlessly fascinates me. And this just seemed like the most direct way that I could explore it, was by building it into the fabric of the narration itself.
And as I was reading and going through, there's these moments where through doing that, somehow Margo becomes more of a character and also less of a character. You're able to like relate more to her, and yet at the same time always be hyper aware that this is like a fictional world that you're existing in. It's very fun, especially when you pair it with the sort of snippets of her own time, like in her English classes, like talking about some of the same things. And I'm like, yes, I think there's so many people who have studied literature or studied writing and then gone on to be like avid readers. It's that feeling between wanting to overanalyze everything you read and wanting to be like, stop it, just enjoy it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I am a book nerd, and I wrote this book for book nerds. And I mean, if you really love reading and you're reading a bunch, we're all nerds. That's the, and so I had to just, I mean, I think that's like the big lesson maybe that I've learned as a writer, is that if you follow what interests you, then that allows people who are like you to find you, and you can't, I mean, just like being a woman in America, you can't please everybody. And so I had to write for the book nerds, because I am a book nerd, and there's no getting around it. Like, that's the kind of thing that makes me excited and sets me on fire.
So this is for the book nerds and the Arby's nerds.
Yes, and go Arby's. I also just like wanted to write one of the things that was so fun slash like just notable when I thought about that whole period of being pregnant and nursing, and I was like getting ready to write the book. I was just my appetite, like, and I imagined that my appetite as a nursing mother was like how it feels to be a teenage boy who's growing, but like I could just put it away. I always was hungry, and I was like, the volumes were astonishing because you're having to make so many calories for this other creature. And so having Margo always be hungry, always be wanting food, always be thinking about food, always be begging Jinx to make more food, and like their fights about the breakfast cereal. And I was like, how many brands of breakfast cereal can I fit into this book? It became like a special challenge of like making it like an ode. Like there's just so much snack food in this book, and it was so much fun to write.
I love like food and ambition when they like and hunger all coming together. It reminds me of Lottie Hazell's book Piglet that came out this year. Just that idea of hunger in women and how we immediately sort of recoil when we come across it. And yet it's such a primal thing.
Exactly. And you have to eat, you know, you're a person. But I think that that is also what appealed to me about it is it's subversive. It's subversive to watch a woman eat and be hungry and crave and then satisfy herself.
I wondered as I was reading so many times too that like I'm picturing Margo sort of alongside Bunny from the Knockout Queen and like all of the ways that they sort of are similar and different. And like I was like, I think they'd be friends.
Oh, I hope they'd be friends. I mean, certainly, I also think Margo and Michael would get along. There's a weird way in which you could argue that Margo is sort of like a fusion between Bunny and Michael because she has that doubleness and that kind of sense of irony and like insight that Michael has, whereas a lot of times things are just like happening to Bunny. But she has a lot of like Bunny's bravery. You know, Bunny's brave and strong and good-hearted. It was such a balancing act of trying to figure out how self-doubt would work for Margo, because there was a way in which I didn't want her to ever truly doubt her own goodness. I didn't want it to be allowed, but I also knew that when you start engaging in behavior that other people are going to judge you for, how can that not be part of your fear? Like, what if I'm a bad person, you know, and how do I make sure that I'm not when other people are telling me that I am? And how do I find the strength to believe in myself, even when other people are saying like, you're bad or you're, you know, a whore, or, you know, horrible things that people on Twitter say to women just who aren't even involved in sex work, you know? But I think those are the moments where Margo doubts herself were like the most painful for me to write on her behalf.
So I always I love a coming of age story. I love something watching someone come into their own. But I think for Margo, on top of just coming into her own as a person and coming into her own as someone who's getting older, she's also really coming into her own agency and she's coming into her own power. And she's finding that these things that suddenly she can make a choice and stand by it, and watching that growth of being like, not only is she able to make the choices, she's learning how to stand by the things that she does. And she's learning how to explain herself to others and when they deserve it, or to just walk away when they don't. And I think that's something really important for young people of all kinds and adult grown people too, to be able to have that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that was maybe the most fun, because I was literally thinking like, I want to write about the mechanics of female empowerment and like how you become confident enough to know what you want, explain it to people, ask for what you want, ignore people who are telling you you're not allowed to have what you want, fight for what you want, have the confidence to find allies, like to help you get what you want. Like, all those things I wanted to be really like distinct moments in the storytelling. It was just really fun to do. I hadn't really, there were a number of ways in which, you know, you're taught, or there's conventions in terms of, you know, teaching writers about storytelling. One of which I was always told was that you can't have a plot be about money. Like someone's core motivating drive can't be money because money is too abstract and it's not like a real human value. Like, so like love is something that can drive someone, loneliness is something that can drive someone, but money isn't enough to be the engine of a novel. And I remember worrying when I was first writing this, like, what if money isn't enough to be like motivating for her? But then I was also like, everyone that I know in real life does almost everything they do because of money. Like how on earth are you supposed to write about real life without writing about money? And so writing about that, but also sort of forgetting everything that I knew about the hero's journey, and trying to decide for myself, like, well, what does my heroine's journey look like? Like, what do I like? Let's forget about Joseph Campbell. Like, forget about those. Like, what do I actually think are the steps of things she needs to learn in order to be a badass by the end? And kind of, I mean, I'm not saying I did anything so wildly inventive, but I didn't really have like a map from somebody else that I was following. I kind of got to make my own map of like, this is how I think it should go. And that was like one of the most artistically exciting and scary parts about writing it.
I love that idea of just being like, well, I have to figure it out because this isn't something that has been written out a million times since, ancient years when we were writing things on tablets and acting things out in togas. Like this is like our problems for now. And I think that that's almost a very privileged perspective to say that you can't write about money because it's not enough of a driving force when, like, for most of the world and most of existence, that is our only thing.
Exactly. I was just like, oh, all my professors were rich. Like, that's said that. It's like they just had never like had jobs.
Yeah, I think that comes up a lot in more. I mean, and I know you've taught a lot of writing in varying different places, and that has been a big part of your career. And I wonder how sort of teaching and writing go together for you.
Oh, I love teaching. And I really lucked into, because for years I was teaching just on and off little like 6 to 4 week classes on Catapult. And part of what was so fun about that was the people who were drawn to taking those classes were mostly, I mean, at least in my classes, they were mostly female and they were mostly middle-aged. And they were like so self-actualized already that you could just like tell them something and they'd immediately be able to put it into practice and improve. It was just really gratifying and fun. Whereas, when you're teaching 18-year-olds, it's like they're busy figuring out that they're bi and they're being in college and getting drunk for the first time. And like, it's not really about just like the pure craft of what you're teaching them. You're teaching them how to be a student. You're teaching them how to be a grown-up. And that is all really fun and rewarding. And I loved the years when I was teaching college, but it's also been really fun in a more intellectual way to teach middle-aged people because it can be more about the intellectual part of it. And then I've had so many of my old Catapult students have now gone on to publish novels. And I'm like, hey, I used to be your teacher. Will you blurb me? It's just like really fun watching them all go on and get so successful. And then one of my students from Catapult started this program called the Book Incubator, which is like a year-long MFA alternative program. And I went to work with her. And so now we run that together and I get to teach revision and she teaches first drafting. And it was this like, again, total freedom. And so she was like, design a year-long curriculum of everything that you would want to teach someone about writing novels. And I was just like, oh, like it was so much freedom. It's like, well, what are all the things? And I got to design it all myself. And it's been so satisfying and fun and exciting to do.
I love that. I love the passion that so many authors have for also teaching and also being like, look, here's something that we can all do, and spreading that wealth of knowledge around, I think is really important, especially in this world of writing, which can seem pretty insular and pretty closed off. And to have that is great.
I think it's one of those, I see sometimes writers talk about they'll like publish think pieces about like jealousy or worrying about publicity or something like this. And I feel like it's such a gift that writers, it's not a zero-sum game. What is the very first thing when you read a really good book? Do you want to buy another book or not buy another book? You want to buy another book. Like, the more good books there are, the more people want to read, the more market there is. Like, it's the one place where it's never a zero-sum game. And all you want is for everyone around you to flourish and all the books to keep getting better and better so that people want to read more books. Like, J.K. Rowling like literally fostered a generation of readers. And like, who knows how many book sales are actually Harry Potter caused of other book sales of other people, as those kids were like, well, what else can I read about wizards? What else can I read about magical worlds? And then they wind up, discovering all sorts of other genres and going on as readers. And so it feels like also writing can be so lonely, and like you're doing it by yourself. And we do that because we're introverts, but even introverts get lonely. And so I think having a space to like foster other writers but also to discuss the stuff that you're figuring out for yourself as an artist, like having a place to talk about it and make it more concrete and real and reflect on it and say like, why does this work this way? Like, and how can I take advantage of that? And could I build a book where the plot works like this? Or, how can I play with POV? Where does it break? How do you get the reader to get emotional besides having your character be emotional? Like those kinds of questions are just like inherently interesting.
I agree. And I have to ask, since we've talked so much about books, I would love to know some of your literary influences, whether on this title or in just your writing in general, some things you love.
Okay, so it took me a long time to realize that I was a comedic novelist. And I think that for me, John Irving was a huge moment where I was like, oh, like he's playful and he's having fun, but he's also, this is a book about abortion literally set in an orphanage, but it's also like really funny. And understanding that you could use humor as a leavening agent that allowed you to talk about the stuff that's really too painful and dark to want to explore otherwise. And that was part of like the alchemy of the cake. So I think John Irving was a big influence on me. But then I also I love Japanese writers. So Murakami, big influence, Banana Yoshimoto. I just really love, and I don't tend to like have magic in my writing, but I really love writers that do. So like I kind of a Kevin Wilson-y, like, the children bursting into flames, or like he's always like flirting with the edge of magic kind of in his work. And I absolutely adore him. I also just love, Jane Smiley is huge for me. I've read every single book she's ever written. And I find she's really interested in larger groups of people. And I think like the further I get in my career, like the book that I'm trying to write next is about a whole larger social group and not just like a core nucleus of people. And so trying to figure out how to do that, I find her so stunning. And then like more recently, I just was so blown away by Kiley Reid's Come and Get It, which I know she's like described in interviews as her acoustic album. And although I felt like it was really propulsive and interesting and ethically interesting, but also the details, like, oh my God, she nails those girls. And it's like, it's painful. Like she's like, and like, this is the water bottle they had. And you're like, oh, it's too much. It's too like, you got it too completely. It's like, it's almost cruel. Like she's so gentle and so clear-sighted and so lucid that it is like, it forms its own kind of suspense. I was a big fan.
I love that. I always like to hear, because like you said, I always need 17 more things to add to my list of things I need to read soon, because as soon as I finish one great book, I need to read more.
Exactly. It's just like, it's a never ending, stream of exciting books.
Do you find yourself missing these characters at all now that you're not writing them anymore? Or are you ready to say, okay, we're done when you finish the book?
Well, okay. So I had originally thought that I was going to write about the business that she and JB start. My original conception of this book was to start with her later in her career. But as I was doing sort of the exploratory writing and finding her voice, I kept going back and back and back. And I was like, no. Okay, I'm going to write the origin story. I'm going to write the coming into that power, because I didn't feel like you could really understand who she became unless you understood how she got there. And then I was like, what if it's a series? And then everyone was like, no. Like they really don't like literary fiction writers to write series for a myriad reasons. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to try and cram it all into one book, so it's not a series. But that's part of what has been so exciting about the idea that now it's going to get to become a show, is like, what if it gets to go on for another season? Like, what if that story of them gets to keep going on? And like, it also is exciting to me. I'm not writing it, but I am an executive producer. So I do get to like, give feedback and be part of where is this going to go and how are the characters going to develop. And so that is really exciting that like, maybe they will get to go on and have more of a life,
I can't wait. I think it's going to be so great. It's such exciting. It's always like exciting when you're like, oh, this has been optioned. But then to see like a lot of great names attached and that you're involved as well, that always makes it so much more exciting.
Oh, it's literally a dream come true. Like, is this actually real? Like, pinch yourself kind of a situation. Because I was a huge Elle fan. I was thinking about there's a moment in The Great where she is crying and because she's so miserable at the Russian court, and her maid is like, well, you could just kill him. And she's like, oh, like, I didn't even know that was an option. Like, I was busy thinking about all the things I'm supposed to do. It never even occurred to me all the things I'm not allowed to do that I could do. Like, she was busy being a good girl. And she was like, I didn't understand the full range of her own agency. And that was in my mind as I was writing this book. And then to get to have a meeting with Elle Fanning and tell her that, it was just like, it's so surreal.
I can't wait. I think there's going to be so many things that come from this book. And I can't wait for people to get their hands on it and to get reading because I think it's really something special. But Rufi Thorpe, thank you so much for joining us today. Margo's Got Money Troubles is out now. And if you are like me, maybe take it and go read it in an Arby's.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.